Hello everybody, so this video is going to be talking about plot and structure in *An Inspector Calls* by J.B. Priestley. So let's start by whizzing through the actual plot of the play, and we'll talk about what happens in which sequential order. So one of the first things to happen is when Gerald gives Sheila the ring. Then Burling gives speeches about how he doesn't think the war's going to happen and the Titanic can't sink. Then Mr. Burling tells Gerald all about this knighthood that he's supposed to be getting. And it's around that time that the inspector arrives. Now, Mr. Burling's actually in the middle of his speech at that point when the doorbell rings. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then the inspector gets Mr. Burling to admit that he got Eva Smith fired. And then Sheila admits that she also got Eva Smith fired from Millward's, the dress shop. And then the kind of cliffhanger at the end of Act 1 is when Gerald is just about to be interrogated by the inspector, and by that point Sheila's already realised that Gerald knew Ava, but under the name of Daisy Renton. And at the very start of Act 2, Gerald is kind of insisting that Sheila should leave the room, and Mr. Burling is supporting that as well. But Sheila refuses, and the inspector backs her up on that and says, no, I think she has a right to stay. It's at this point as well Mrs. Burling threatens the inspector because Mrs. Burling also doesn't think Sheila should be there, but also Mrs. Burling's getting quite kind of angry at the fact that the inspector's being so controlling, and she's really resisting what he's kind of telling them, the message that he's bringing. Then we have Gerald and his whole interrogation and his admission that he did keep Eva Smith or Daisy Renton as a mistress. Then Sheila gives back the ring to Gerald. Mrs. Burling then admits that she turned Eva Smith away from the charity. And at the end of Act 2, when Mrs. Burling is absolutely laying into the anonymous father of the child and saying how he should be held to account for the responsibility. And the cliffhanger of Act 2 is when Mrs. Burling has just realised who the father is. Sheila helps her along with that revelation, and Eric enters the room just as the curtain falls at the end of Act 2. Beginning of Act 3, we have Eric's interrogation following on from that. So he admits his relationship with Eva Smith. He then admits stealing money from Mr. Burling. Then the inspector leaves, and we see the fallout from that. So we see Mr. Burling fearing a public scandal. Gerald is very intent on proving the point that the inspector wasn't real, and he calls in a favour at the station for that. They think he's fake, and then of course this wonderful ending where they receive the phone call saying that a girl has just died and that an inspector is coming. Wonderful plot twist. So let's talk about this in a bit more detail. We can see it as a chain of events, and this is actually a quote from the inspector himself. It's an interlocking play. One thing leads on to the next thing, and even as I just described there, Act 1 goes into Act 2 and Act 2 goes into Act 3. And and this is one of the points that the inspector is trying to prove. They all played a part in this, and everything leads on to the next. So Mr. Burling sacked Eva, then Sheila has her fired as well, which just solidifies this feeling of isolation and destitution that Eva is experiencing. Then she has this saving grace when she thinks it's a saving grace when Gerald finds her and puts her up in his friend's apartment and takes her as a mistress. She's in love, she's happy, she's provided for, she has shelter, she has accommodation, etc. Then Gerald gets rid of her and tells her that she has to move out. Then she is pushed into this world of prostitution, and Eric meets her while she's working as a prostitute. They have a very brief relationship, and very questionable if that was a consensual relationship. She becomes pregnant. Eric offers her money to deal with this situation, but it's stolen, and she refuses to take it, which again shows this very moral side to her. And then Mrs. Burling has her part to play when Eva arrives at the charity because of Eric's actions, and refuses to help. And then we have Eva committing suicide. So one thing very much leads on to the other. There's quite a few questions on this slide that I think would be good for you to have a think about and ponder over. So if you want to pause it on this slide and work through the questions down here, 1 to 5. There's also some talking points up here, so you could have a class discussion here and discuss this as well if you're watching this in class. So in the lectures that we've been watching over the previous couple of weeks, if your teacher's been showing you them, one of the professors argued that you can put this play into 3 sections structurally. And I really like this theory, so I wanted to share it with you now. So the first section would be the opening. So this starts with the family party, everything's very kind of positive. We have the celebration of the engagement, etc. And this section would end when the inspector arrives. And we have that wonderful shift in lighting where it goes from pink and intimate to cold and hard. So it's showing that the honeymoon phase is over, metaphorically, of course, in that they can't live in this bubble, this naive bubble. They have to have the inspector come and actually teach them what's really happening out there in the world. Then we have the central section, which is all of the interrogations. So that would go from Burling's interrogation right up to the end of Eric's. And then it ends when the inspector leaves. So after he's finished interrogating Eric at the start of Act 3, he then gives that wonderful ending monologue, that you will pay for this in fire, blood and anguish, and all of those wonderful quotes, millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. Lots of excellent quotes there for you to use. And then the concluding section would be what happens after that. And for me, this is, I think, the most interesting part of the whole play. It's how the characters process this information. It's how they try and cope with it and kind of explain it in their minds, and how they try and almost rationalize what they've just gone through. And of course, the brilliant ending when the phone calls and the final twist. We could argue that this play has a cyclical structure, and this is mainly brought about by the ringing of the doorbell and the ringing of the phone. So at the very beginning of the play, the real action is sparked by the arrival of the inspector, and this is done through a stage direction where it says that there's a sharp ring of the doorbell, and it's wonderful because it interrupts Mr. Burling's speech about how a man needs to look after himself and not look after anyone else. It's that wonderful quote about bees in a hive, and he doesn't think that we should act like that, and he thinks it's everyone for himself. And right at the very end, Burling and Gerald are almost regressing and going back to that kind of speech again, and they're congratulating themselves on avoiding a scandal and how the inspector was fake and how they don't have to pay for any of their actions, they don't have to take on any responsibility, and of course the phone rings. And so we have this cyclical structure where the ringing of the doorbell and the ringing of the phone are there to try and make these characters take on responsibility. And I think it works really well. It's important to note that this play does not follow the usual structure of a play in that we normally see it through the theory of Freytag's pyramid. So in Freytag's pyramid, you'd have a very obvious exposition, something that happens to spark the action, then the action and the tension start to rise. So imagine that tension is here on the y-axis here, and on the x-axis you have kind of time. Then you'd have the highest point of tension, so the climax. Then the action would start to fall, and then you have this very low area of tension, which is where things get wrapped up neatly normally, and we have a resolution or a denouement. Of course, this play does not follow this. This is a bit more what this play looks like. So the inciting incident, if we just go back to this slide, sorry, quickly, the thing that really sparks the action, the inciting incident is the inspector's arrival. So it is that doorbell ringing and Edna coming in and saying, "Sir, an inspector's calling." Then we have the rising action, which is layer upon layer of these interrogations. And the tension rises every time we find out that one of these people did something awful to this girl. So this is all rising action. Now, the climax, I think we could argue where this is. I think some people might actually argue this is the end of Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3, where Mrs. Burling realises it was Eric and where Eric returns. Remember, Eric disappears for quite a while, and then he returns ready to face his interrogation. And actually, I think that says quite a lot about his character, that he does come back. He is ready to face his crimes, as it were. He is ready to take responsibility. Then we have a bit of falling action. So after the inspector leaves, like I said, this aftermath section where they're all rationalising and finding ways to cope with this psychologically. And they just think they're safe. So we get to this really low point of tension. Well, I say they think they're safe. Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald think they're safe. Sheila and Eric very much don't agree. But then the telephone rings and the tension shoots back up again. So in your essays, you can say, we do not have a denouement, or we do not have a resolution. We are left on a high point of tension. And what you need to do in your essays is talk about the effect of that. So we end on a high point of tension, we end on a climax, we end on this plot twist. And the intention by Priestley is to leave the audience feeling tense and to make them feel on edge. And I also think it's to make them question things, because it's left on such an ambiguous note as to who this inspector was throughout the whole play. And this would have been such a great play to go and watch for the first time in 1945. I think leaving the theatre, walking out with your friends or family and talking about this, I think this is a play you talk about for the rest of the evening. Maybe you'd go for dinner afterwards and you'd just spend the whole meal talking about this, because there's so much to dive into. Who was that man that came to the house? Was he a supernatural figure? Was he just someone from the neighbourhood who hated the family and wanted to make them pay? Was it a relative of Eva Smith? Was it Eva Smith's ghost that's come back in the form of a man? There are so many theories out there, and there's so much to dive into here. Also, I think another thing to discuss would be the extent to which each character is to blame. So that's something you could explore as well. The timing's really important in this play. Just moving on to a different kind of topic now. One thing to really keep an eye on is when people enter the room and when people exit the room, because people are on stage for some bits and off stage for other bits, and it's actually really important. I think when we kind of think back on the play, I think we wrongly assume that they're all on stage all at once, but then really not. Sometimes there's only a couple of people in the room. This comes into play when they're discussing the photographs and they're talking about, oh, well, who actually got to see the photographs and things like that when they're talking it through in Act 3. But it also, there's a lot of stage directions here that you could quote that show characters' reactions to things. So, for example, when the inspector arrives, it's just Burling, Gerald and Eric. So it's just the men. They're having their cigars and port. Sheila running off stage when she realises that she's to blame for Eva's kind of downfall. At the end of Act 1, it is just Sheila and Gerald on stage. This draws the information out for the audience because we need the inspector to come back to fill in the gaps. So like I said, at the end of each act as well, it's very important who's on stage and who isn't. So for example, at the end of Act 1, the last line is the inspector saying to Gerald, well, and he's kind of, he's getting Gerald to make his admissions. The end of Act 2 is when Eric just comes back on stage as well. So that's really important. One thing that happens in this play is that the information is almost drip fed. So it's gradually revealed, one person at a time. And the inspector, I think, has a quote at one point where he says, that's the way he likes to work, one line of interrogation at a time. Or I think he says one line of inquiry at a time, which I think is Priestley kind of being quite naughty there and playing on that. Because actually, of course, that's Priestley wanting to structure his play like that and wanting to keep us, the audience, on our toes. and that's the sign of a good play, really, releasing information slowly and building the tension as you go. Right, chronology then in this text. So this text, for the most part, is chronological. We do find out the kind of outcomes of the interrogations in sequential order, apart from they swap around Mrs. Burling and Eric. So we find out about Mrs. Burling first, which of course is the most recent chronologically. It was only a couple of weeks ago that Ava got denied the help from the charity. And then we find out about Eric's affair with her after that. Now, the reason that those are swapped around is for dramatic irony. Priestley wanted us to realise that Mrs. Burling had turned the mother of her grandchild away, to kind of vilify Mrs. Burling even more. Vilify means to make someone into a villain or expose them as being a villain. And so this is for dramatic irony. This is for the audience to see Mrs. Burling as an irresponsible, selfish woman who is not helpful to the lower classes. The text has always also been written to follow Aristotle's theory of unity of action and time. Aristotle believed that a good play should take place in a short period of time, and also unity of action. So we experience every twist and turn along with the characters, and we have just as much time to process the revelations as they do. So we're almost going on this journey with them, that the inspector is creating and that Priestley is creating. And I think that's a really important thing that you could talk about in your essays as well. This effect that Priestley creates on the audience, that we are watching this. I also think it's important to note in terms of setting, we never leave the room. We never leave the drawing room or the dining room. So that would create a really claustrophobic feeling for the audience as well. It's these very intense, heavily dialogued, lots of words in these scenes. And so as an audience member, you're just sitting there. There's no release of tension. There's no kind of breather. It's just bam, 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 bam. There is one interval between Act 1 and 2, and then another interval between Act 2 and 3. So you do get short breaks there. But even then, you're left on cliffhangers. So you're left very tense. In a normal play, you'd have a lot of scene changes, set changes. You kind of have that change, and there's not so much cabin fever or claustrophobia. But again, this is something you can talk about in your essays. Priestley wanted the audience to feel on edge. He wanted them to feel tense, because that's how the characters are feeling. He wanted to emulate the experience of the characters for the audience. They feel trapped in that dining room by the inspector, just as we, the audience, kind of feel trapped too, just by staring at this same set. So that's a really important thing to note as well. Just some key terminology to note here. Again, remember, you do get up to 4 marks for AO4 on this essay. So it's very much worth learning some very good pieces of vocabulary to slot into your essays. So the first one is coup de théâtre, which is a French term. Don't overly worry about getting your accents correct here. Obviously, if you could, then fantastic, but at the end of the day, it's an English exam, not a French exam, so don't panic. This is a surprising turn of events in a play. Now, I think we have quite a few coup de théâtres. I think the main one is at the end, when the telephone rings, because I don't think anyone's expecting that. I think by that point, we, along with Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling and Gerald, have kind of come to the assumption that that was a fake and that it didn't happen. And then we have this plot twist where we realise, oh, someone is coming and the girl has died. The next one is well-made play. This just means a tightly structured play with a strong climax and denouement. So to some extent, it's a well-made play. It is quite tightly structured, and there is a strong climax. But as I've argued previously in the video, I think you would have to explain that there isn't really a denouement. There's a partial denouement that lulls you into a false sense of security, and then there's the coup de théâtre, which changes that. Another key term here that you could use is didactic, which means a text that was intended to teach a lesson about something. So that could be a moral message or a political message. Priestley's play has both of these. It's strongly didactic. He wanted to teach people to take on more responsibility for each other, to be kinder to each other, and he also wanted to promote his socialist views. So it's very much a didactic text, very similar to Christmas Carol in that respect. And then a polemic is a strong message against something. So you could write that Priestley spreads his polemic against capitalism through this play. And it's definitely something, as I said in my context video, that was extremely close to Priestley's heart. Just one link on here in terms of further study, which is a video on YouTube all about structure. I think there's so much out there for plot. I didn't just want to kind of overload this with links for plot summaries and plot revision videos, because you can type all of that into yourself, into YouTube yourself. This is just one video that I'd recommend on this. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and good luck in your tests.